The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I know that because I'd been lying awake watching the ceiling fan turn slow circles in the dark, the way I do most nights since my wife passed. My daughter's number lit up the screen. She never called this late. I answered before the second ring. Her voice was strange, muffled, like she was trying to speak without moving her jaw. She told me she was in the parking garage of her apartment building and she couldn't go upstairs. She said her husband's mother had come by that afternoon. She said something happened and she didn't want to tell me over the phone, but she needed me to come. I was in the truck before she finished the sentence. My daughter Ivy is 32 years old. She's a pediatric nurse. She's steady, practical, the kind of person who stays calm when everyone else falls apart. I've seen her work through things that would crack most people. The fact that she was sitting on a concrete floor in a parking garage because she couldn't make herself take the elevator up to her own apartment told me more than whatever words she was about to say. I found her next to a support pillar on the second level, arms wrapped around her knees, still in her scrubs from a shift that had ended 6 hours earlier. When she saw my headlight, she stood up fast and tried to look okay. She didn't look okay. She had a bruise forming along her left cheekbone. I sat down on that concrete floor right next to her. I didn't say anything at first. I put my arm around her and I waited. What she told me over the next 40 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 3 years. Her mother-in-law, a woman I'd always found brittle and difficult, but had managed to be polite to at holidays, had arrived at their apartment that afternoon without calling. Ivy's husband wasn't home. He was at a conference in Dallas, supposed to be back Thursday. His mother had a key because they'd given her one for emergencies. 6 months ago, when Ivy had been working overnight shifts and they'd needed someone to water the plants, she'd used that key to let herself in. She told Ivy she needed to show her something. She had a folder, printed emails. She laid them out on the kitchen table one by one, the way someone does when they've been rehearsing. Then she told Ivy that her son had been unhappy for 2 years, that he'd been confiding in her, that the marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, because Ivy wasn't the right fit for their family, and the right thing for everyone would be for Ivy to move back to Georgia, where she'd grown up, quietly and without making things difficult. Ivy told me she almost laughed. She thought it was surreal. She told me she said something like, "I'm sorry, you came into my home to tell me to leave my husband." That was when his mother grabbed her by the arm. Not a gentle grab, the kind that left a mark. She'd shoved Ivy backward into the kitchen counter. When Ivy caught herself and said she was calling her husband right now, his mother took her phone off the counter and put it in her purse. She stood between Ivy and the door for 20 minutes, told her that if she called anyone, if she made any trouble, she would make sure Ivy's nursing license was called into question. She knew someone on the licensing board, she said. She'd been collecting information for a year. She knew about a complaint from a patient's family that had been reviewed and dismissed. Knew about a medication discrepancy that had turned out to be a documentation error. Knew about things that looked bad on paper, even when the truth was clean. When she finally left, she took the folder with her. She told Ivy to think carefully. Ivy had sat in that apartment for 3 hours before she could make herself move. Then she'd gone down to the garage because she didn't feel safe upstairs, and she'd called me. I listened to all of it. I kept my voice very steady the whole time, the way you do when you understand that the person next to you needs you to be a wall right now, not a window. Inside, something went cold and very quiet. I've felt that before, twice in my life. Once when I got a call that my brother had been in an accident and they didn't know if he was going to make it. Once when my wife got her diagnosis. That specific coldness means I've shifted into a different gear. It means I'm done processing and I've started planning. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a general contractor in Central Texas. I've built houses, commercial buildings, a few schools. I've dealt with suppliers who tried to shortchange me, clients who tried to not pay, subcontractors who cut corners in ways that could have killed people. I know how systems work. I know how money works. I know how people behave when they think they have leverage. I knew what I needed to do. First, I took my daughter to my house. She didn't argue. I made her eat something, and I called her husband in Dallas. He didn't pick up. I left a message that was calm and specific. His mother had come to the apartment. There had been a physical altercation. Ivy was with me and she was okay, and he needed to call me back tonight. He called back 40 minutes later. I could hear something in his voice I didn't know how to read yet. He said he'd talked to his mother. He said it wasn't as simple as it sounded. He said his mother had been under a lot of stress. I told him his mother had grabbed my daughter and left a bruise on her face and threatened her professional license. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's been worried about some things, about the future. I need you to understand her perspective here." I told him I'd talk to him when he got back to Austin. I hung up. My daughter was sitting at my kitchen table listening to half that conversation. She looked at me when I put the phone down. She had this expression I recognized from when she was about 8 years old, and had started to understand that adults weren't always what they presented themselves to be. A particular kind of careful, quiet attention. I asked her if there was anything else she needed to tell me. She told me she was 8 weeks pregnant. She hadn't told her husband yet. She'd been waiting for the right moment, she said. She'd been waiting for the right moment, she said. She'd found out 10 days ago. She'd made a doctor's appointment for next week because she'd had some concerns, some cramping, and she wanted to make sure everything was okay before she said anything. I put my hand over hers on the table and I didn't say anything for a little while. Then I told her we were going to take care of everything. I told her the baby was going to be fine. I said it like I knew it for certain even though I didn't, because sometimes that's what your child needs to hear. She went to sleep in her old bedroom. I sat at the kitchen table and I started making a list. My son-in-law came home from Dallas the next afternoon. He came to my house instead of going to the apartment. That told me something. He sat across from me at the same table where I'd sat with Ivy the night before. He was 36, worked in commercial real estate. He had the kind of face that was easy to read if you knew what to look for. He was scared. He started talking about his mother, her history, her anxieties. He talked about how she'd grown up in a particular kind of family, how she had certain beliefs about the way things should go, about the kind of life he was supposed to have. He said she'd been pressuring him for a long time, and he'd been trying to manage it quietly. I let him talk. I found that if you let someone talk long enough, they'll eventually say the true thing. The true thing came out about 15 minutes in. He said he'd known his mother was going to talk to Ivy. He said he hadn't known it was going to go that far, but he'd known she was planning to have a conversation. He said he thought maybe it would be better coming from her than from him. I asked him what that meant. He looked at the table. He said things hadn't been right for a while. He said the marriage had felt like it was moving in a direction he hadn't expected. I asked him to tell me specifically what that meant. He said his mother had some concerns about what their life was going to look like, about what their family was going to look like. I asked him what was wrong with what their family looked like. He didn't answer that. I looked at him for a long moment, and I said, "Your mother came into my daughter's home and put her hands on her. My daughter has a bruise on her face. My daughter is pregnant with your child, and she was so frightened she sat in a parking garage for 3 hours because she was afraid to be alone in the apartment you share. And you were sitting here talking to me about your mother's concerns." He looked up. He said, "I didn't know about the pregnancy." I told him that didn't change a single thing I'd just said. He left. He went to a hotel. I knew this because Ivy tracked his location on the app they both had on their phones, the one couples use so they can see where each other are, and she showed me in the way she showed me everything now. Quietly, without drama, just the facts. I went to work. The first thing I did was call my daughter's OB and explain that she'd experienced a physical altercation and needed to be seen as soon as possible. They brought her in that afternoon. The baby was fine. Strong heartbeat. The doctor documented the visit, documented Ivy's description of what had happened, documented the bruise. When I picked Ivy up from that appointment and she told me the baby was okay, I sat in the parking lot for a minute with my eyes closed. The second thing I did was call a family law attorney I'd worked with years ago on a contract dispute that had turned into something uglier. She was sharp and she was thorough, and when I walked her through what had happened, she didn't blink. She said we needed to document everything immediately. The bruise, photographed. A written account from Ivy while the details were fresh. any messages or voicemails. She said what the mother-in-law had done potentially constituted assault and battery under Texas law, and the threat against Ivy's nursing license could be characterized as extortion or coercion. She said, "Tell me everything you know about this woman." I told her what I knew. His mother was a widow. Her husband had died 6 years ago and left her well provided for. She sat on the board of a charitable foundation, volunteered at a church, had a reputation in their suburb north of Austin as a certain kind of respectable, particular woman, the kind of woman who was very concerned with how things appeared, the kind of woman who thought, that gave her the right to walk into someone's home and make demands. I also made a third call. My brother-in-law, my late wife's younger brother, had spent his career in human resources and then workplace investigations. He'd retired 2 years ago, but he still knew people, and more importantly, he knew how to find things. I asked him to help me understand what kind of documentation trail might exist around this woman's activities. He called me back in 2 days. What he'd found started to explain some things. Her son, my son-in-law, had a trust established by his father that was substantial, a little over $2 million, managed by a financial institution in Dallas. The trust had specific language about distribution, and one of the conditions for certain distributions was that the trustee, who was his mother until the terms changed at age 40, had to approve major life decisions. It was outdated language, the kind of thing that was common in certain older estate plans and that most families worked around informally. But it was there. She'd been using it. My brother-in-law found 2 instances where she had formally withheld approval for trust distributions that her son had requested. Once 3 years ago, when he and Ivy had wanted to buy a house and needed the down payment. The money had been delayed for 4 months because his mother had submitted documentation questioning whether the purchase was in his best financial interest. They'd eventually gotten it, but the delay had cost them the first house they'd made an offer on. And once 18 months ago, when he'd wanted to make a significant investment in a business deal, and she'd blocked it entirely. My son-in-law had never told Ivy about any of this. Not the trust language, not the delays, not the fact that his mother had structural financial control over decisions in their life. I sat with that information for a day. Then I sat with something else. My brother-in-law found. 3 years ago, before Ivy and her husband were engaged, his mother had hired a private investigator. I didn't know this initially. It came out through a contact my brother-in-law had in a small network of PI firms in the Austin area. The investigator had been asked to look into Ivy's background, her finances, her family history. He'd found nothing damaging because there was nothing damaging to find. My daughter is exactly who she appears to be, and he had declined to continue the engagement when the client began asking questions that he felt crossed a legal and ethical line. Specifically, she had asked him to look into whether Ivy's grandfather, who had come to the United States from Mexico in the 1960s and become a citizen, had any documentation irregularities in his immigration history. Ivy's mother, my late wife, was the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She grew up in San Antonio, became a registered nurse, which is how we met, and she was one of the finest people I have ever known. She died of pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, and there is not a day that goes by that I don't miss her. Ivy has her cheekbones and her hands and her steadiness. His mother had paid someone to dig through immigration records looking for something to use against my dead wife's family. I'm 64 years old, and I've tried to be a calm, measured person for most of my adult life. I build things. I believe in patience. I believe in doing the work. But I sat at my kitchen table with those documents in front of me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger exactly. Colder than anger. The feeling of understanding exactly what you're dealing with and exactly what you need to do about it. My daughter didn't know any of this yet. I needed to tell her. I also needed to tell her that her husband had known, at least in part, what his mother was capable of and had made choices accordingly. I brought Ivy back to my house that evening. I laid everything out on the table. The trust documents, the PI firm information, the timeline. I walked her through it the way I would walk a client through a building plan. Here's what exists. Here's what it means. Here's where the problems are. She listened without interrupting. Ivy has always done that, listen completely before she responds. It's one of the things about her that makes her so good at her job. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he knew about the trust and never told me. She said it like she was confirming a measurement, like she needed to hear herself say it to know it was real. I told her yes. She said she was trying to find something wrong with Grandpa's papers to use against us. I told her yes. She looked at the table. She said, I've been trying to make her like me for 3 years. She said it without bitterness, almost like a research conclusion. I've been bringing her things from the farmer's market because someone told me she liked local honey. I invited her to my mother's garden, the one I keep in the backyard, because I thought maybe she just needed to know us better. I thought she just needed more time. I told my daughter that there was nothing she could have done differently, that the problem had never been her. The next morning, I contacted an estate attorney who specialized in trust litigation. She reviewed the trust documents and told me that the trustee language, while it had been legal when written, had been applied in ways that were potentially actionable as financial abuse under Texas law, particularly given that the beneficiary was an adult and the decisions being delayed or blocked were clearly within his rights. She said that with the right documentation, we could pursue a petition to have the trustee removed and the terms revised. She also said something interesting. She said that in her experience, when people set up these kinds of control structures in estate documents and then use them aggressively over years, there's often a reason beyond just control. There's often something they're protecting, some asset, some arrangement, some decision that they made and don't want questioned. I asked her to look a little deeper. What she found, working with a forensic accountant she recommended, took about 3 weeks. His mother had been making distributions from a separate account that was technically part of his late father's estate, but had not been fully disclosed in the estate settlement. It wasn't a huge sum in the context of the overall estate, roughly $340,000 over 6 years, but it had gone to expenses and arrangements that suggested she had been supplementing her own income in ways that the estate documents didn't authorize. There were also 2 transfers to an LLC registered in Nevada that had no obvious legitimate business purpose. My attorney told me that what we had was potentially probate fraud. She said it would need to be referred to the appropriate authorities, but that as a preliminary matter it gave us substantial leverage. I want to be honest about something. I did not handle this quietly out of some desire for revenge. I handled it the way I would handle any structural problem that was threatening my family. I identified the load-bearing issues, I brought in the right specialists, and I documented everything before I moved. That's how you build something that holds. That's how you make sure it doesn't fall apart in the middle. We went to the authorities in the right order. First, the Austin Police Department, where Ivy filed the formal report of assault and battery against his mother. The officer who took the report was thorough. Ivy had the medical documentation, the photographs, the written account she prepared with her attorney. His mother was contacted and interviewed. She denied touching Ivy. The investigation was open. Then we went to the district attorney's office with everything my attorney and the forensic accountant had found. The unauthorized distributions, the Nevada LLC transfers, the documented pattern of coercive trust management. The DA assigned an investigator, and then I made a call that I had been thinking about for 3 weeks. My brother-in-law knew a woman who had been a reporter for the Austin American-Statesman for 20 years before going independent. She covered financial crime and family court issues. I'd read her work. She was precise, and she was fair, and she didn't sensationalize. I called her and I told her I had a story about estate fraud, financial coercion within a family, and a physical assault that was currently under police investigation. I told her I was willing to go on record. She asked me 3 questions. The first was whether I had documentation. The second was whether the legal proceedings were formally initiated. The third was whether my daughter had consented to have her story told. Ivy had asked me, when I proposed this, whether it was necessary, whether we could get justice through the legal process alone. I told her we probably could on the criminal side, but I told her about those other women my brother-in-law had found. 2 women her husband had dated before Ivy, both of whom had been subjected to similar pressure from his mother, one of whom had been investigated on a false complaint that had turned out to be connected to a tip from an anonymous source. Neither of them had had anyone to help them figure out what was happening. Neither of them had known what they were dealing with. Ivy said yes. The story ran on a Friday. By Saturday afternoon, it had been picked up by the Texas Tribune and shared several thousand times. By Monday, it was in the Dallas Morning News. His mother's name, her role on the charitable foundation board, her years of managing her son's trust in ways that a forensic accountant had characterized as potentially fraudulent, the police investigation, the assault complaint, all of it was in the public record now. The foundation asked her to step down from the board while the investigation was ongoing. She resigned the same day before they could formally act. His mother hired a defense attorney. It took 5 weeks before that attorney contacted our legal team with a settlement proposal. Our attorney reviewed it and told me it was an opening offer designed to make us feel heard while protecting all of the important assets. She told me to be patient. I was patient. 2 months later, in the context of the probate fraud investigation, which had expanded when investigators found additional transfers we hadn't initially identified, his mother entered into a negotiated agreement with the state. She paid back $410,000 to the estate, acknowledged the unauthorized distributions, and accepted a supervised financial arrangement for the remaining estate assets. She was not charged criminally, a decision that frustrated me, though our attorney explained that first-time financial offenses of this type rarely result in prosecution when full restitution is made, and the amounts, while significant, fall below certain thresholds. It wasn't the outcome I would have designed, but the money went back where it belonged. The assault case took longer. She ultimately pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of misdemeanor assault. She received probation and a fine and was required to complete an anger management program. I watched Ivy sit in that courtroom, and I watched his mother's attorney argue that the incident had been a misunderstanding, an emotional moment between two women who had struggled to connect. The judge did not appear moved by this framing. She addressed Ivy directly before pronouncing the sentence and said that entering someone's home without permission and placing your hands on them was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. Ivy thanked her. My son-in-law. I've thought a long time about how to describe what happened there. He moved back into the apartment initially after a week at the hotel, and there was a period where Ivy was trying to determine what was real in their marriage and what wasn't. She told me he seemed genuinely shocked by some of what came out in the investigation, the things his mother had done that he hadn't known about directly. She said he cried more than once. She said he was also clearly relieved, in a way he probably didn't understand himself, that the structure his mother had built around his life was finally being dismantled. But she also knew what he'd admitted to me at my kitchen table, that he'd known his mother was going to confront her, that he'd let it happen because he thought it would be easier than doing it himself. Whatever that conversation was meant to be, whatever his mother had planned and then escalated, he had opened the door to it. Ivy filed for divorce 4 months after the parking garage. She told him in person, directly, which is who she is. She told me she didn't do it in anger. She told him that she believed he was a person who was genuinely capable of becoming better, but that she was not willing to build her life, or her child's life, on the foundation of who he was right now. He didn't contest the divorce. He's been in therapy, from what Ivy has told me, and he has asked to be part of the baby's life. Ivy has said she'll make those decisions when the time comes, one at a time, based on what she sees. That's fair. That's exactly who she is. The trust situation resolved through the probate process. With his mother's trustee authority formally suspended pending the fraud investigation, my son-in-law was able to petition for independent management, which was granted. He's navigating that separately. It's his money and his life and none of my business anymore. My daughter's daughter was born on a Thursday morning in March, 8 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and the most serious expression I have ever seen on a person who is approximately 4 minutes old. Ivy named her Rosa Celeste, after my wife's mother and after the word Ivy had always used to describe the Texas sky at dusk. That particular shade that isn't blue or purple, but something in between. I was in that delivery room. I held Ivy's hand through the part she needed me there for, and stepped out when she asked me to. When the nurse brought Rosa Celeste to me in the hallway, and I held her for the first time, she looked at me with those serious dark eyes, and I didn't have anything to say. I just stood there in that fluorescent light holding 8 pounds of my wife's legacy, and understanding that this was the entire point of everything. His mother never met her. I'm not a person who dwells on what other people deserve. That's above my pay grade, honestly, but I've noticed in the past year that the things she built her life around, the reputation, the control, the careful architecture of her son's existence, none of it survived contact with the truth. The foundation board didn't take her back. The social connections that depended on her presenting a certain face have quietly repositioned. Her son is in therapy in another city, working on understanding why he spent 36 years managing her expectations rather than living his own life. She still lives in that house north of Austin, and I understand from my attorney that she is quiet now in a way she apparently wasn't before. I think about what it takes to spend years building walls around a person you claim to love. What kind of fear that requires. What kind of loneliness. Then I think about Rosa Celeste learning to hold her own head up, watching things with those eyes that see everything. I built toys for her the way I built toys for Ivy when she was small. Wooden blocks, sanded smooth. A little rattle. I've started on a rocking horse, which is taking longer than I expected because I want the proportions right. I want it to be something she can actually use as she gets bigger. Ivy brings her over on Sundays and we sit in the backyard where my wife's garden still grows, roses and herbs and one stubborn bougainvillea that has no business surviving Central Texas winters but does anyway. Last week, Rosa Celeste grabbed my finger and held on. Her grip was stronger than you'd expect. She held on and looked at me and made a sound that wasn't a word yet but was clearly the beginning of something. I've been a builder my whole life. Concrete and wood and steel, things meant to last. But the things that actually last aren't the structures. They're what happens inside them. The Sunday mornings and the hands held and the garden that keeps coming back every spring, whether you're paying attention or not. My wife would have loved this little girl so much it would have been embarrassing to watch. I'm going to make sure Rosa Celeste knows that. I'm going to make sure she knows where she comes from, both sides, all of it. She'll know her great-grandmother's name and her great-grandmother's hands and the country her great-grandmother's hands and the country her great-grandmother's family came from and what it cost them to make a life here. She'll know her grandmother's garden. She'll know that when people tried to erase her before she existed, the people who loved her didn't let that happen. That's not revenge. Revenge is about making something stop. What we built is about making something go. There's a difference. And Rosa Celeste is going to grow up knowing exactly what it is. I've been sitting on my back porch a lot lately watching Rosa Celeste sleep in the portable bassinet Ivy sets up out here on Sunday afternoons. The bougainvillea my wife planted is doing that thing it does every spring, putting out more color than it has any right to given how little I water it. And I find myself thinking about causes and effects, not in any grand religious sense, just the plain mechanical truth of it. What you build determines what stands, and what you hollow out eventually collapses under its own weight. Delia spent years building something that looked solid. The reputation, the board seat, the careful management of her son's money and choices and future. From the outside, it probably looked like love. Maybe she even told herself it was. But the structure was rotten at the load-bearing points because it was built on the idea that some people's blood made them less than others. That's not a foundation. That's a termite colony with good paint over it. What I've come to understand through all of this is that doing right by people isn't just a moral position. It's a structural one. When Ivy spent 3 years bringing that woman local honey and inviting her into my wife's garden, she was trying to build something real. When Delia hired a private investigator to dig through a dead woman's immigration history, she was revealing exactly what kind of person she had chosen to become. Those choices accumulated. They always do. The person who does the patient, honest thing consistently, and the person who manipulates consistently. They're both building toward an outcome, and time is just the process of finding out what it is. I think about Miles a lot, too. He was not a villain in the way his mother was. He was something harder to reckon with, a person who knew better and kept choosing comfort anyway. He let things happen because letting things happen was easier than the alternative. And he paid for that not through any punishment I arranged, but through the simple consequence of having been that person. You can go to therapy and work on yourself all you want, and I genuinely hope he does. But you can't take back the years you spent managing your mother's feelings while your wife sat in a parking garage too frightened to go upstairs. Those years happened. They shaped things. What I hope Rosa Celeste takes from her mother's story, not now, she's 6 months old and currently focused primarily on whether she can fit her entire fist into her mouth, but someday, is this: being a good person requires all three things working together. It requires the moral clarity to know what's right and refuse to compromise it, even when staying quiet would be easier. It requires the intelligence to understand what you're actually dealing with, to gather the facts, to bring in the right people, to document before you act. And it requires the toughness to keep going when things are hard and uncertain, and there's no guarantee it works out the way it should. Ivy had all three. She had them from her mother, I think, and she had them from years of being a pediatric nurse, which is a job that teaches you very quickly that sentiment without competence helps no one. I'm 64, I've built a lot of things. The ones that last are the ones where you didn't cut corners on the parts nobody sees. The ones that fall are the ones that looked fine until they didn't. I believe that's true of houses, and it's true of families, and it's true of the kind of person you're deciding to be, one choice at a time, over the course of a life. Rosa Celeste grabbed my finger last Sunday and held on with a grip that surprised me. I'm going to spend whatever years I have left making sure she grows up knowing how to do the same thing.